Welcome to The Humble Podcaster, the podcast where we help you follow through on your dreams of creating your own show by providing practical knowledge, tips, and tricks on podcast production. I'm your host, Chris Hill, and before we dive into this episode, we need to have a bit of a heart-to-heart. After getting through the questions and thoughts in the previous two episodes, I'm sure you're ready to move on and get your podcast built and launched. And I am too. But first, we need to discuss one of the biggest dangers in podcasting. I'm talking about pod fade. Pod fade is industry slang for burning out on your show. When things are going well and you're getting great feedback on your content, you're going to be easily motivated to keep going. However, the minute the download numbers begin to stagnate and each new episode becomes a drag to create, you're going to find it harder and harder to continue. For most podcasters, pod fade sets in about episode 7 or 8, which at this stage may sound shockingly early. But remember, even as a weekly show, that represents 2 months worth of content. Perhaps you'll decide you're just not that into podcasting. Maybe it's too complicated, or maybe your creativity will seize up around episode 4 and you'll struggle to make it to 7 or 8. Or maybe it's the editing that'll get to you. Podcasts can be a pain to edit, especially if you're just starting, learning how to do script reads and mic technique. Maybe you'll hate the sound of your own voice. Sure, your mom says you've got a voice for radio and a face to match, but when you hear it, it just sounds grating and obnoxious. Or perhaps it'll be too hard to find guests for your show. Logistics will bog you down and be the death of you, too. It could be any number of things, but rest assured that pod fade hits us all eventually. What we have to do is decide how we're going to handle it when our time comes. In my time producing content, I've found some simple steps to overcome pod fade, but it's still going to take you being committed to the work in order to get through it. The first thing you can do to avoid pod fade is tied to the format of your show: frequency. Deciding on a season, limited run series, or monthly, bi-weekly, or weekly series is going to really impact the way you approach your show. If you're doing a season, you don't even necessarily have to release anything until you've created everything for that season. The same is true of limited run series. You can just do the work of creating the content and then release the show at a cadence your marketing team can keep up with. And that said, this process isn't always ideal. In fact, the more pre-recorded content you have stored up for release, the less likely your show will succeed. Why is this? It's because there's less room for audience feedback. Therefore, if this is your first rodeo, I strongly recommend you avoid the record and edit everything before you release method. Creating in a vacuum is dangerous, and podcasting is always a two-way conversation between the creator and the audience. The important thing here is finding a frequency to which you can comfortably commit. That frequency will be related to the intensity of the content you create and the format you choose. So the next thing we need to consider is, of course, your format. There are an endless number of formats you can choose for your show, but for the sake of sanity and simplicity, I'm going to narrow it down to just 3 segments: solo, interview, and narrative. Solo series are definitely some of the most challenging to create. Remember what I said about creating in a vacuum? You're basically creating and producing everything yourself. Maybe you're a prolific writer, or you can improvise new content on the fly, and if that's you, awesome. But just wait until you hear yourself back for the first time. Even if you're in love with the sound of your own voice, you're almost guaranteed to find something you'll not like and want to rework. This is where having a good editing team or other people to run your content by is important. I make sure to do this myself, even though I've written, edited, and produced all these episodes. I still try to run this by my content team and even my wife just to make sure I'm creating interesting content, and I definitely encourage you to do the same. Also, if you're going to write every script and read it out like I'm doing for this show, then you're absolutely going to want to make sure that your schedule allows you the time to do that. Each episode I write will be around 1,500 to 1,000 words, and broken down at a normal talking pace, that's between about 130 and 150 words a minute, which is roughly 10 to 15 minutes of audio. If you want to do an hour, you'll be writing 7,800 to 9,000 words per episode. Keep in mind that a novel is considered to be a story with over 80,000 words, so in roughly 10 episodes, you'll have a full novel. That's awesome if you plan on writing a book, or if you're Dan Carlin from Hardcore History. And to that point, look at how often Dan comes out with new material. It's not that often, because it takes a lot of time to produce. Worth it, but not often. Interview content, on the other hand, is much easier to create. I know folks that can sit down with a complete stranger at a few talking points and come out with a fantastic show. Their experience in the industry or on the topic and their personal ability to improvise allows them to do this really well. Of course, that's not everybody, but with practice and a good format, this becomes easier and easier. And we'll get into this in more detail when we discuss creating a framework for your show. The challenge with the interview podcast is finding guests. If you don't already have a guest list being built for your interview show, start now. It takes time to get on people's schedules, and things are always coming up that will slow you down if you're not already ahead of schedule. As for narrative content, it's a beast. Not only do you have to write content, but depending on the series, you'll need to interview people, review the interviews, and decide how those interviews inform your narrative. Then you have to take all of that, write the narrative, record it, and then edit all of that audio together. And I can tell you, we're currently producing a couple of these series at HumblePod, and it's not easy. I definitely don't advise trying to do a narrative series on your own. Build it as a team. Even if it's just one other person that's with you, they'll do more to help you get past the creative barriers than you could ever do on your own. Once you've decided which of these 3 segments your show is going to be in, it's time to build a structure for your show. Structure can vary quite a bit between segments, so for the sake of keeping it simple, let's pretend we have an interview show. There are 3 basic sections for this show: the intro, the body, and the outro. When I approach a new show, the first thing we typically do is decide what the intro and outro are going to be. This is important because this will set the tone for the rest of the show. If you've been keeping up with the show so far, you'll already have your messaging and positioning ready to go. And here's where you've already got some work done for you. For the intro to your podcast, we're going to utilize a couple of pieces that we've already developed. Specifically, the show's name, because we need to identify what show this is, and the one-sentence description, since it's a simple and succinct way to describe what your show is about. Now, since you're not reading this, I'm going to use my best robot voice to help illustrate the fill-in-the-blank sections of the formula here. Say hi, Robo Chris.
Hi.
Okay, so the formula is welcome to the
Insert name of podcast here.
where we,
Insert one-sentence show description here.
in the case of this show, it's welcome to the Humble Podcaster, the podcast where we help you follow through on your dreams of creating your own show by providing practical knowledge, tips, and tricks on podcast production. You can get way more creative with it than that, but you should always make sure that your one-sentence description is at the beginning of your show in some way or shape or form if you're doing a solo or even an interview formatted podcast. The reason you do this is, you guessed it, positioning. This allows you to make sure each time your listeners hear the show, they are reminded why they are here and why they're listening to the episode. It's also important because you never know what episode someone will listen to first. This allows your first impression to clearly state the purpose of your show and engage your listener. It may feel a little cheesy at first, but believe me, it's worth it. On the other side of the track, we have the outro. Its purpose is to be your closer. This is what you want to say at the end of every episode to make sure people know where to find, follow, and subscribe to your show. I highly recommend you make this a pre-recorded segment, or at least script it for every episode so that you don't forget to include it. The outro follows a similar format to the intro. If you're looking for a template, here's what I recommend as a starting place. Thank you for listening to
Podcast.
You can keep up with the latest on the
Podcast website.
And be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us on
Social media links.
and we'll see you next time.
Or insert your show tagline here.
And just to see how all this fits together, here's what we have for the Humble Podcaster. Thank you for listening to the Humble Podcaster. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at humblepodcaster.com, and be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find us at HumblePod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, stay humble, stay on course, and keep on podcasting. Now that you've gotten the scripts written, you're probably going to be ready and raring to record. But before you run off, please know there's more to cover here, and there is a lot to consider before you really pick up the mic for the first time. If you want to save yourself some time and even maybe a little sanity, you can wait to record until we're through with the next few episodes in this How to Start a Podcast series. Okay, now that we've addressed that, it's time to choose some music. And as you consider what music to have, think about your audience and what kind of music they like. Think about the tone you want to set for your show and pick some tracks accordingly. By the way, one pro tip for when you record: put your intro and outro on a loop when you sample music. It might sound a tad bit annoying to hear yourself over and over again, but it will let you sample a bunch of music without having to download every song. When considering music, the other challenge you're going to face is, will I face copyright infringement for this song? In general, if you're going to use a pop song, the answer is almost certainly, yeah, you are. Yes, I know. Many folks will talk about having a 30-second rule where you can supposedly use up to 30 seconds of audio before it's copyright infringement when it comes to podcasts. And sure, in general, sharing a podcast isn't as restrictive as content going to YouTube in that you won't get immediately DMCA'd, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be careful. The best legal explanation of this that I've read comes from the Broadcast Law blog. In an article titled, "Using Music in Podcast, Talk to the Copyright Holders, Why You Can't Rely on Your ASCAP, BMI, SESAC, and Sound Exchange licenses," they discuss the challenges with their own broadcast licenses in podcasting. And the too long didn't read there is that, quote, BMI controls only a portion of the rights necessary to use music in podcasts, unquote. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, that sucks for broadcasters, but how does that apply to my podcast? The article dives deeper into this and says that if you want to use any pop music, quote, podcasts, even when streamed, are made available on demand. Therefore, the rights to reproduction and distribution of the words and music of a song must be obtained. These rights are obtained directly from the copyright holder, usually the publishing company with which the songwriter is affiliated, unquote. So, in short, you must get your license from the license holder. If you really, really want that song, you're going to have to get it licensed from the owner of said license, which can be harder than it sounds, because not only do you have to find the original writer of the song, but you've got to find out where that license is housed, and then negotiate with said company for the license. And to that I say, good luck. Okay, that covers the legality of mainstream music. But what about an artist you know personally? If you can get permission from them in writing, then I say, I'm not a lawyer, ask a lawyer. The key is that you want to make sure you're as above board as possible with content. Should you start to garner a large following and bring on advertising, which I genuinely hope you do, you're going to want to be sure that you don't have a lawyer looking at your profits and deciding that you owe their musicians for the music on your show. As for where to get legal music, I recommend a licensing service. My personal favorite is Soundstripe, and there's a lot others to choose out there too. Just make sure you pick one with music you like but haven't heard on other content before. Similar to how you pick a stock photo. As with everything, differentiation is key. Once you've got your music chosen and your intro and outros complete, you've got some reusable content for each episode. And great job getting to this point, by the way. We're really close to being able to put this show out into the world. For your homework, I want you to get your intro and outro written and the music chosen. If you're not ready to record yet, don't worry. We will cover the basics for recording and editing soon. Well, as much as you can on a podcast. For now, just having everything ready to go will be enough. Extra credit, though, for those of you who do get it all done before next week. Speaking of next week, in our next episode, we're going to dive deep into how to structure the body of your podcast and create what should be everyone's first episode, the trailer. Thank you for listening to The Humble Podcaster. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at humblepodcaster.com, and be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find us at HumblePod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, stay humble, stay on course, and keep on podcasting.
This has been a Humble Pod production.
Stay humble.